The bullet carved its path through the morning air of Ouagadougou like destiny itself, silent, inevitable, precise. President Ibrahim Traoré felt the impact before he heard the shot, a sledgehammer blow to his chest that sent him sprawling across the red earth of his ancestral compound. Blood bloomed across his white boubou like scarlet flowers, each drop falling to kiss the soil his grandfathers had farmed for generations. The second bullet struck the ancient baobab tree behind him, bark exploding in a shower of fragments that caught the golden morning light. The tree, 1,000 years old, witness to the rise and fall of empires, shuddered but stood firm, its massive trunk absorbing what would have been a killing shot. Allah Akbar, his bodyguard Sergeant Bakary Ouattara shouted, diving to shield the president's fallen body with his own. Around the compound, chaos erupted, voices screaming in Moor, French, and Diola as security forces scrambled to locate the shooter. But Ibrahim Traoré, lying in the dust with his life bleeding out through a hole in his chest, felt a strange calm descend upon him. The ancestors were calling. He could hear their voices on the wind, speaking the old words his grandmother had taught him as a child. Barki and Isaida. Barki and Isaida. Strength and patience. Strength and patience. 3 hours earlier, before the sun had crested the hills east of Fatangourma, Traoré had been kneeling on his prayer mat in the modest room he kept at his family's ancestral home. The presidential palace in Ouagadougou was comfortable, certainly, but when he needed to think, truly think, he came here to the village where his bloodline stretched back 13 generations. The call to far prayer had echoed across the sleeping hamlet, broadcast from the small mosque his great-grandfather had helped build with hands that knew both the Quran and the older traditions that preceded Islam in these lands. As was his custom during these private retreats, Traoré prayed first as a Muslim, then stepped outside to pour libations of water and millet beer for the ancestral spirits, honoring both faiths that shaped his people. "Mr. President," his aide Moussa Diallo had whispered from the doorway, reluctant to interrupt the morning ritual. "The delegation from Chad is arriving early. General Ouedraogo sends his apologies. A security matter requires your immediate attention." Traoré nodded, wiping his hands on a simple cloth. At 62, he had learned that presidential business respected neither prayer time nor ancestral communion. The liberation of Burkina Faso, from French neo-colonial control, from the extraction economy that enriched foreign shareholders while his people remained poor, demanded constant vigilance. "What manner of security matters?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected. Mining consortium representatives arrived unannounced at the capital last night. French, Canadian, Australian interests. They're requesting an emergency meeting about the nationalization decree. Mousa's expression was grim. Intelligence suggests they may not be merely seeking negotiation. Traoré had expected this. 3 months ago, his government had signed legislation reclaiming Burkina Faso's gold and uranium resources from foreign corporations, a move that threatened billions in expected profits. The mining companies had tried economic pressure first, then diplomatic sanctions through their respective governments. Violence had always been the inevitable next step. Cancel the Chad delegation, he decided. Return to the capital immediately. If they want a meeting, we'll give them one, on our terms with full security protocols. But Moussa shook his head. "Sir, with respect, the intelligence indicates the threat is here, not in Ouagadougou. They know your pattern, that you come to the ancestral village when making difficult decisions. They're counting on your predictability." Traoré felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. His grandmother Jamila had warned him about this very thing in a dream the previous week, a vision of strangers with pale eyes and dark intentions stalking him through familiar places. He had dismissed it as stress, the weight of governing a nation under constant pressure. Now he wondered if the ancestors had been trying to warn him. "Then we spring their trap," he said simply. "But on our terms." What followed was a swift conversation via encrypted satellite phone with General Seydou Ouedraogo, his most trusted military advisor. A plan emerged. Traoré would maintain his normal schedule at the village, but with concealed security enhancements. Snipers would be positioned on nearby hills, plainclothes agents infiltrated among the villagers, emergency extraction routes prepared. "The ancestors are with us," Traoré told Moussa as they prepared to implement their counter-trap. "This soil has seen invasions before. The French came with guns and Bibles thinking they could break our spirit. They learned otherwise." But as he spoke these confident words, Traoré felt the weight of solitude that came with leadership. The decision to nationalize the mines had been his alone, made in this very compound after 3 days of prayer and consultation with village elders. He had known it would bring retaliation but had believed, hoped that his peoples united could overcome foreign corporate power. Now, as he walked through the compound where his ancestors had lived, loved, and died for centuries, he wondered if his idealism had finally overreached reality. The morning rituals continued as planned. Traoré visited the village school, greeting children whose future he was fighting to secure. He met with the Council of Elders, listening to concerns about water rights and crop prices that remained urgent despite the grand political transformations happening in the capital. He participated in a naming ceremony for a newborn child, placing his hand on the infant's head while offering blessings in the old words. Through it all, his security detail maintained careful vigilance, eyes scanning rooftops and distant hills for signs of threat. The villagers, unaware of the danger, went about their daily business. Women grinding millet, men repairing tools, children playing elaborate games of hide-and-seek among the mud-brick houses. It was during the final ceremony, the traditional pouring of water at the base of the great baobab tree, honoring the spirits of the land, that death came calling. The sniper had chosen his position with professional skill, concealed nearly a kilometer away on a rocky outcrop that offered clear sight lines to the ceremonial ground. Through his scope, Traoré would have appeared small but distinct, his white presidential boubou marking him clearly against the red earth. The first shot was meant to kill instantly, a clean chest shot that should have dropped him before he knew he was hit. But as the bullet flew toward its target, a gust of harmattan wind, the dry desert breeze that carried both sand and spirits, shifted the trajectory just enough. Instead of piercing his heart, the bullet struck his upper chest, missing vital organs by centimeters. The second shot, fired in haste as the sniper compensated for the wind, went wide entirely, embedding itself in the sacred baobab tree with a hollow thud that seemed to resonate through the compound like a war drum. Then chaos. Security forces converged on the president's position while others fanned out in pursuit of the shooter. The villagers, many of whom had lived through coups and civil conflicts, moved with practiced efficiency. Children were hustled into houses, elders took cover behind thick walls, young men grabbed whatever tools could serve as weapons. But Traoré himself, lying in the red dust with Sergeant Ouattara's body shielding him from further fire, felt something extraordinary happening. The wound in his chest burned like fire, but beneath the pain, he sensed a deeper transformation beginning. "Mr. President." Moussa dropped to his knees beside them, his hands already bloodied from pressing against the wound. "Medical team is en route. Stay with us." "I'm not going anywhere," Traoré managed, his voice weaker than intended but firm in conviction. This land has seen worse than bullets. Around them, the security operation unfolded with military precision. Lieutenant Colonel Aminata Konate, commander of the Presidential Guard's Rapid Response Unit, coordinated the manhunt via radio while field medics worked to stabilize their wounded leader. Sector 7 clear. Moving to Sector 8, came one report. Possible egress route identified. Road checkpoint established, came another. But the sniper had vanished as professionally as he had appeared, leaving behind only brass casings and the knowledge that foreign interests were prepared to kill to protect their African investments. "Sir," Sergeant Ouattara said urgently, "helicopter ET 3 minutes. We need to move you to the extraction point." Traoré tried to sit up, waves of dizziness washing over him. "Not yet. First." He looked around the compound, his gaze falling on the assembled villagers who watched with fear and concern etched on their faces. "First I speak to them. Mr. President, you're losing blood." "Then help me stand," Traoré commanded with authority that cut through his physical weakness. These people deserve to hear from their leader, not wonder if bullets have silenced another African voice. With Moussa and Ouattara supporting him on either side, Traoré rose unsteadily to his feet. The blood stain on his boubou had spread, but his posture remained dignified as he faced his people. "My brothers and sisters," he called out, his voice carrying across the compound with surprising strength. "Today, enemies of our sovereignty tried to silence the voice of Burkina Faso. They failed." A murmur ran through the crowd, relief, anger, determination. "The bullet they fired was meant not just for me but for our dreams of true independence. For our children's right to benefit from the wealth beneath our feet. For the end of the colonial mindset that sees African leaders as expendable obstacles to foreign profit." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, drawing energy from the connection with his people. "But what they do not understand, what they have never understood, is that we are not just one man, one voice, one target. We are the descendants of Sundiata, of Samori Touré, of Thomas Sankara. We are the children of this soil, and this soil remembers how to resist." The crowd erupted in applause, voices raised in the traditional praise songs that had celebrated acts of courage for centuries. The work continues, Traoré concluded, swaying slightly as blood loss began affecting his balance. Whether I live or die, the mines remain ours. The resources remain ours. The future remains ours. Only then did he allow himself to be helped toward the helicopter landing zone, leaving behind a blood stain on ancestral soil that would be remembered and spoken of for generations to come. As the medical helicopter lifted off, carrying him toward emergency surgery in Ouagadougou, Traoré looked down at the village shrinking below. The great baobab tree, wounded but standing, dominated the landscape like a monument to endurance. He touched the bullet wound gingerly, feeling the pain but also something else. A strange sense of completion, as if some cosmic test had been administered and passed. The ancestors had been present at that moment, he was certain. The wind that deflected the killing shot, the tree that absorbed the second bullet, the strength that allowed him to address his people despite his injury, these were not merely fortuitous coincidences. "How are you feeling, sir?" asked Dr. Fatima Ouedraogo, the flight medic working to stabilize him during the journey. "Like a man who has just discovered something important about himself," Traoré replied, his words slightly slurred by pain medication. "And about his enemies." What he had discovered, though he would not fully understand it until much later, was that the assassination attempt had not weakened him politically, it had transformed him into something far more dangerous to foreign interests than a mere president. It had made him a martyr who refused to die. The intensive care unit at Ouagadougou's Centre Hospitalier Universitaire Yaugado Ouedraogo hummed with activity that had nothing to do with normal medical procedures. Beyond the doctors and nurses working to save President Traoré's life, the corridors filled with a parade of visitors that would have been impossible to imagine just days before. General Seydou Ouedraogo sat in vigil outside the ICU, his weathered face betraying none of the political calculations racing through his mind. As the highest-ranking military officer loyal to Traoré, he had assumed emergency powers immediately after the shooting. But unlike previous military interventions in Burkina Faso's turbulent history, this one was designed not to seize control but to preserve it to ensure the democratically elected government survived its leader's brush with death. "Any change?" asked Aminata Konate as she approached, her fatigue evident after 36 hours of coordinating the investigation into the assassination attempt. "Stable but critical," Ouedraogo replied. "The surgeons say the next few hours will determine whether he didn't finish the sentence, as if speaking the possibility aloud might make it manifest. And the situation outside? That was the extraordinary development neither had anticipated. Word of the assassination attempt had spread through Ouagadougou like wildfire, carried by radio broadcasts, social media, and the ancient network of market gossip that could span continents within hours. But instead of the fear and fragmentation that usually followed such incidents, something unprecedented was happening. The people were rallying. Not just in Burkina Faso but across West Africa. In Mali, students had organized massive demonstrations supporting Traoré's resource nationalization policies. In Ghana, gold miners had gone on strike demanding better terms from foreign companies. In Senegal, intellectual societies were holding emergency conferences on neo-colonial economic assassination. The attempt to silence one African leader had somehow amplified the voices of millions. President Kone of Mali called an hour ago, Aminata reported. He's prepared to offer military assistance if needed. President Ouattara from Côte d'Ivoire sent similar assurances. Even President Macron's office reached out through diplomatic channels. Ouedraogo raised an eyebrow. The French want to help investigate an assassination attempt they likely financed? They want to control the narrative, Aminata clarified. Offering cooperation now allows them to frame this as the work of rogue elements rather than state policy. It was a familiar playbook: distance official governments from the dirty work of corporate interests, maintain plausible deniability while benefiting from the results. But this time the strategy was backfiring spectacularly. Inside the ICU, President Traoré drifted between consciousness and dreams, his body fighting to repair the damage while his mind processed fragments of memory and vision. He found himself walking again through his ancestral village, but now the compound was filled not just with his own clan but with faces from across Africa: farmers from Nigeria, miners from the Democratic Republic of Congo, fishermen from Senegal, all speaking in their different languages but somehow communicating with perfect understanding. "You have become the voice they tried to silence," said his grandmother Jamila, appearing beside him as he had often seen her in childhood, bent with age but radiating an inner strength that seemed to illuminate the space around her. "But at what cost, Nana?" he asked in the dream language that transcended words. The bullet nearly found its mark. Next time? There is always a next time for those who challenge power, she replied, her blind eyes somehow seeing everything. But you have learned something your enemies did not expect. That martyrdom begins not with death but with the willingness to die for principle. She gestured toward the assembled faces around them, hundreds becoming thousands, thousands becoming millions. They shot at one man and wounded a continent. They tried to kill an idea and instead gave it flesh and blood. The bullet that struck you will echo in every mine shaft, every government ministry, every corporate boardroom where African resources are bought and sold like trinkets. In the waking world, Dr. Fatima Ouedraogo checked her patient's vital signs with growing optimism. The surgery had been successful, the bullet had been removed, damaged tissue repaired, internal bleeding stopped. But more importantly, Traoré's recovery was proceeding faster than medical science would typically predict. His blood pressure is normalizing, she told Moussa Diallo, who had maintained a constant vigil beside the bed. Brain activity is strong. I think he's going to pull through. Moussa felt relief wash over him like a physical wave. As Traoré's closest advisor, he had prepared contingency plans for governmental continuity, but he had also grappled with the personal loss of a man he considered both mentor and friend. When will he regain consciousness? Moussa asked. Soon, I think. His sleep patterns suggest he's already fighting to wake up. As if summoned by their conversation, Traoré's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he appeared confused, trying to reconcile the sterile hospital environment with his last clear memory of lying in red dust under the baobab tree. Then awareness returned, sharp and complete. Moussa, he said, his voice hoarse but clear. What's our status? The question was so typically Traoré, no self-pity, no dwelling on his brush with death, just immediate focus on responsibilities that Moussa had to smile despite the gravity of the situation. The country is stable. General Ouedraogo has maintained security. The investigation is ongoing. He paused, then added with obvious satisfaction, and the mining companies are in full retreat. Traoré's eyebrows rose slightly. Explain. Over the next 20 minutes, Moussa provided a comprehensive briefing on the political earthquake the assassination attempt had triggered. The international solidarity, the corporate panic, the media attention that had exposed decades of economic exploitation across Africa. All of it flowing from a single bullet that had failed to find its ultimate target. The French government is demanding a full investigation, Moussa concluded, while quietly pressuring their mining companies to accept our nationalization terms rather than risk further exposure. Traoré absorbed this information with the analytical mind that had made him a formidable leader, but beneath the political calculations, he felt something deeper stirring, a sense of destiny fulfilled, of ancestral prophecy made manifest. Bring me General Ouedraogo and Colonel Konate, he instructed. And arrange a secure communication with the other West African presidents. If they want to stand together, we should coordinate our response. Sir, the doctors say you need rest. The doctors can say what they like, Traoré interrupted gently but firmly. But right now, there's a window of opportunity that won't remain open indefinitely. If we're going to transform this crisis into lasting change, we must act while the world is watching. As Moussa left to arrange the meetings, Traoré closed his eyes briefly, not from fatigue but to center himself for what would come next. The assassination attempt had been meant to end his political influence. Instead, it had amplified it beyond anything he could have achieved through normal diplomatic channels. But with great opportunity came equally great danger. The forces that had tried to kill him once would not hesitate to try again, and next time they might be more thorough. The corporate and governmental interests threatened by African resource sovereignty represented trillions of dollars and centuries of established exploitation patterns. They would not yield easily. Dr. Ouedraogo entered with her evening rounds, carrying a tablet displaying his latest test results. Your recovery is remarkable, Mr. President, she said, reviewing the data. Physically, you're healing faster than we expected. But I'm concerned about the psychological impact of the trauma. Have you experienced any flashbacks, anxiety, or depression? Traoré considered the question seriously. By all medical logic, he should be experiencing significant psychological aftereffects from a near-death experience. Yet he felt no trauma, no fear, only a crystalline clarity about his purpose and the path forward. Doctor, he said carefully, have you ever felt that certain events in your life were preordained? That you were being prepared for a specific role or test? She looked at him with professional concern. That's not uncommon after traumatic experiences. A sense of destiny or divine intervention can be part of the psychological recovery process. I'm not speaking of psychological recovery, Traoré clarified. I'm speaking of spiritual recognition. Of understanding that some moments exist outside normal time and causation. Dr. Ouedraogo was quiet for a moment, then set down her tablet. My grandmother was a traditional healer in Bobo Dioulasso. She always said that Western medicine could repair the body, but only ancestral wisdom could heal the spirit. Are you saying you believe spiritual forces intervened in your survival? I'm saying that the bullet which should have killed me struck a baobab tree instead. That the wind which deflected it blew at precisely the right moment. That I found strength to address my people while bleeding into the soil of my ancestors. Traoré met her eyes directly. Medical science explains the mechanics of my survival. But something else explains its meaning. Before she could respond, General Ouedraogo and Colonel Konate entered the room, their expressions mixing relief at seeing their president conscious with urgent concern about the rapidly evolving political situation. Sir, the general began without preamble, we've identified the sniper. Belgian national, former military with a record of corporate security work in Africa. He was extracted by helicopter immediately after the shooting, sophisticated operation, professional support team. Belgian, Traoré mused. Interesting choice. Far enough removed from French interests to provide deniability, but with historical colonial connections to provide motivation. The extraction helicopter was registered to a charter company owned by a subsidiary of Mine Rice du Sahel, Colonel Konate added. The same corporation that's been lobbying against the nationalization decree. The confirmation of corporate involvement came as no surprise, but it provided crucial intelligence for the broader political response Traoré was planning. What's the timeline for my discharge? He asked Dr. Ouedraogo. Mr. President, you were shot less than 48 hours ago. Typically, recovery from this type of trauma requires weeks. Typically, presidents aren't shot by mining companies either, Traoré interrupted with dry humor. I need to be mobile within 72 hours. Whatever medical support that requires, arrange it. The urgency wasn't merely political posturing. Intelligence reports suggested that corporate interests were already regrouping, preparing new strategies to counter the wave of African solidarity his survival had triggered. Delay would allow them time to fragment the coalition, to bribe individual leaders, to orchestrate counter-narratives that painted the assassination attempt as an isolated incident rather than symptomatic of systemic exploitation. There's something else, Colonel Konate said, her expression grave. Communication intercepts suggest another phase of the operation is still active. The assassination attempt may have been just the opening move. Traoré felt a chill that had nothing to do with his medical condition. What kind of phase? Economic warfare. Coordinated attacks on our currency, infrastructure sabotage, perhaps false flag operations designed to destabilize the region and justify international intervention. The pattern was familiar from across Africa. When direct political control failed, create enough chaos to justify humanitarian intervention that coincidentally served economic interests. Libya, Côte d'Ivoire, Mali had all experienced variations of the strategy. Then we accelerate our timeline, Traoré decided. General, coordinate with our neighbors, Mali, Niger, Ghana. If they're planning regional destabilization, we respond with regional integration. Colonel, initiate our media offensive. Every international outlet that wants an interview gets one, but only if they agree to discuss the broader pattern of corporate assassination across Africa. Sir, General Ouedraogo said carefully, that level of accusation could trigger serious retaliation. Traoré smiled, the expression somehow making him look younger despite the medical equipment surrounding him. My friend, they already tried to kill me. What worse retaliation could they threaten? The logic was irrefutable, but it also marked a fundamental shift in Traoré's approach to leadership. The man who had attempted to navigate between African sovereignty and international relationships was gone, replaced by someone who had stared death in the face and emerged unafraid of consequences. As his advisors left to implement their new strategy, Traoré lay back in his hospital bed, feeling the pull of exhaustion but also the electric energy of purpose. Tomorrow would bring challenges that would test not just his political skill but the strength of the movement he represented. But tonight, as he drifted toward healing sleep, Ibrahim Traoré felt the presence of his ancestors gathering around him. Generations of resistance fighters, anti-colonial heroes, and ordinary people who had chosen dignity over submission. The bullet had been meant to silence their voice forever. Instead, it had given that voice the power to wake a continent. President Traoré's first public appearance following the assassination attempt came not in a government building or hospital press room, but in the courtyard of his ancestral village, beneath the same baobab tree that had stopped the sniper's second bullet. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. The leader returning to the very spot where he had nearly died, demonstrating both his survival and his unbroken connection to the land. International media crews had descended on the small village like locusts, their satellite trucks and camera equipment creating a surreal juxtaposition with the traditional mud brick architecture and ancient rhythms of rural life. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24, Deutsche Welle, outlets that would normally ignore Burkina Faso entirely now competed for exclusive access to the man who had become a symbol of African resistance to neo-colonial control. But Traoré had insisted on one condition for the interviews: they would be conducted in his ancestral language of Moor, with simultaneous translation provided. The foreign journalists, accustomed to African leaders accommodating their linguistic preferences, were forced to adapt to his terms, a small but significant reversal of the usual power dynamic. Barca. Welcome to my home, Traoré began, addressing the assembled media in Moor as village elders, security personnel, and international journalists clustered around him. Though still bearing visible signs of his ordeal, a slight pallor, careful movement that favored his wounded chest, his voice carried the strength and authority that had made him a formidable political leader. The first question came from a BBC correspondent. Mr. President, there are allegations that the assassination attempt was orchestrated by foreign mining companies opposed to your nationalization policies. Do you have evidence to support these claims? Traoré paused, allowing the translator to render the question into Moor, then responded in his native language with patient deliberation. The hyena does not announce itself before attacking the shepherd's flock, he said, the translator struggling to convey the metaphorical richness. But when the shepherd survives and the hyena's tracks are found in the sand, only fools pretend the attack was coincidence. He gestured toward the baobab tree, where the bullet scar was clearly visible in the ancient bark. This tree has stood for 1,000 years. It has seen the French come with guns and Bibles, claiming they brought civilization to savages. It has seen independence declared and betrayed by leaders who sold their people's birthright for foreign approval. It has seen coups and counter-coups, each justified as necessary for stability while resources flowed away from African soil into European vaults. The power of his words, delivered in the language of his ancestors, created an atmospheric tension that translated cameras couldn't fully capture. Village children gathered at the edges of the crowd, following the exchange with wide eyes despite not understanding the foreign questions. A French journalist from Le Monde pressed further. Surely you're not suggesting the French government was involved in an assassination plot against an ally? This time Traoré's smile was sharp as a blade. I suggest nothing. I state facts. Belgian sniper. Swiss accounts. Corporate helicopters. Supply chains that lead back to Paris boardrooms where old men in expensive suits decide which African leaders live and which must die for questioning their rights to our gold, our uranium, our labor. The directness of his accusation sent ripples through the international media corps. This was not the diplomatic deflection they expected from African leaders walking the tightrope between sovereignty and international pressure. But something unexpected happened, Traoré continued, his voice growing stronger. The bullet that was meant to silence one voice awakened millions. Students in Dakar, miners in Johannesburg, farmers in Lagos. All understand now that the threat to one African leader is a threat to every African child's future. CNN's correspondent jumped in. President Traoré, your critics argue that your resource nationalization policies will drive away foreign investment and harm Burkina Faso's economic development. How do you respond to those concerns? The question triggered something deeper in Traoré's expression. Not anger, but a kind of profound sadness mixed with steely determination. Listen carefully to what this question reveals, he said, looking directly into the CNN camera. My critics, who are they? The same corporations that have extracted $127 billion worth of gold from Burkina Faso over the past 2 decades while our people remain among the poorest on earth? The same investors who demand concessions and tax exemptions while our children walk kilometers for clean water. He stood slowly, his movement causing a ripple of concern among his security detail, but his posture remained dignified. They speak of economic development while 60% of our population lacks electricity. They praise foreign investment while profits leave on every flight to Paris, London, New York. They warn of isolation while isolating us from the benefits of our own resources. A journalist from Al Jazeera asked, "What message do you have for other African leaders considering similar nationalization policies?" Traoré's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying across the compound with the resonance of traditional griots reciting heroic epics. The message is simple: we are not powerless. We are not cursed by geography or blessed with resources that can only be developed by others. We are the descendants of Sundiata Keita, of Queen Zinga, of Patrice Lumumba, of Thomas Sankara, leaders who understood that true independence requires economic sovereignty. He gestured toward the assembled villagers, many of whom were recording the exchange on mobile phones that would broadcast his words across social media networks faster than traditional news outlets could process them. When they shoot at one of us, they shoot at all of us. When they destabilize one economy, they threaten every economy. When they corrupt one leader, they insult every leader. The choice before African leadership is simple: stand together or fall separately. The power of his words was amplified by their setting, delivered not from a presidential palace but from red earth where his ancestors had lived for centuries, beneath a tree that had absorbed a bullet meant for his heart. The visual metaphor was impossible to ignore. African leadership literally rooted in African soil, drawing strength from ancestral wisdom rather than foreign approval. A Swiss journalist pressed what many considered the crucial question: but realistically, Mr. President, how can small African economies resist the pressure of multinational corporations backed by major world powers? The economic retaliation could be devastating. Traoré's laugh was surprising, not bitter or defensive, but genuinely amused. Devastating? More devastating than the current system where we export raw materials at controlled prices and import finished goods at market rates? More devastating than structural adjustment programs that forced us to privatize our utilities so foreign companies could charge our people for water from our own rivers? His expression grew serious again. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith once said that the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. These threats of devastating retaliation, they assume we have something left to lose. But people who have been systematically impoverished for decades understand something that boardroom strategists do not. Poverty itself can be a form of freedom. He paused, allowing the translation to catch up, then continued with building intensity. We are no longer afraid because we have seen the bottom. Our children already walk barefoot to schools with no books while foreign companies report record profits from our mines. Our farmers already struggle with drought while international agribusiness exports our food. Our youth already migrate to Libya and Morocco seeking opportunities denied at home while development aid returns as debt payments to European banks. The crowd had grown during the press conference, with villagers from neighboring communities arriving to witness this unprecedented moment. Their president, wounded but unbroken, addressing the world from their shared ancestral ground. So let them threaten economic retaliation, Traoré declared, his voice rising like a traditional praise singer celebrating ancient victories. Let them withdraw their exploitative investments and predatory loans. Let them impose sanctions that primarily hurt their own consumers. We will trade with China, with India, with Brazil, with each other. We will develop our own technologies, train our own engineers, and build our own refineries. A German journalist from Deutsche Welle attempted a different approach. Mr. President, what guarantees can you offer that resource nationalization won't lead to corruption and mismanagement, as critics point out has happened in other African countries? The question hit at a genuine concern that resonated even among Traoré's supporters. African history was littered with resource booms that had enriched elites while ordinary citizens remained poor. Transparency, Traoré answered simply. Every mining contract, every revenue stream, every development expenditure will be published online in real time. Every citizen with a mobile phone can track how their resources are being used. Every village chief, every student leader, every market woman can hold us accountable. He gestured toward his phone, which one of his aides was using to live stream the press conference to social media platforms. The technology exists now to make resource extraction completely transparent. The only reason for secrecy is theft. So we eliminate secrecy and make theft impossible. As the press conference continued, something extraordinary was happening across social media. Hashtags like #Bullet couldn't silence Africa and #Traoré survived began trending globally, shared not just by African users but by people worldwide who recognized the broader implications of corporate assassination attempts against democratically elected leaders. Video clips of Traoré's most powerful statements, translated into dozens of languages, spread faster than traditional news outlets could analyze them. Young people in European and American cities, many learning for the first time about the scope of resource extraction from Africa, began organizing solidarity demonstrations outside mining company headquarters and government buildings. The final question came from a Burkinabe journalist speaking in Moor. Mr. President, many of our people wonder if you fear another assassination attempt. Will this change how you lead? For the first time during the press conference, Traoré was silent for an extended moment. He looked up at the baobab tree, its massive canopy filtering the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns of light and shadow. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality that seemed to reach beyond the immediate audience to something larger and more enduring. Fear? He repeated, tasting the word. Yes, I fear. But not bullets. Not corporate boardrooms plotting in distant capitals. Not economic sanctions or diplomatic pressure. He touched his chest where the bullet had struck, the gesture unconscious but powerful. I fear failing my ancestors who died resisting colonization. I fear betraying my children who will inherit whatever Burkina Faso we leave them. I fear standing before the Creator and explaining why I chose comfort over courage when my people needed leadership. The compound had fallen completely silent, even the international journalists seeming to understand they were witnessing something beyond normal political theater. The bullet that struck me was not aimed at Ibrahim Traoré. It was aimed at the idea that African leaders can serve African interests instead of foreign profits. It was aimed at the possibility that our resources could build our schools instead of European mansions. It was aimed at the dream that our children can grow up on land they own instead of land they rent from corporations. He stood fully now, his movement strong despite the recent trauma, and spread his arms to encompass not just the village but seemingly the entire continent. They can fire 1,000 bullets. They can hire 1,000 assassins. They can orchestrate 1,000 coups. But ideas are bulletproof. Dreams cannot be assassinated. The spirit of a people who have survived slavery, colonization, and neocolonialism cannot be killed by Belgian snipers hired with mining profits. As he spoke these final words, something remarkable happened. The village children who had been watching from the edges began clapping rhythmically, their hands creating the traditional percussion accompaniment to praise songs. The sound was picked up by their parents, then by the elders, until the entire compound resonated with the ancestral rhythm that had celebrated heroes and victories for centuries. The international media, trained to maintain professional distance, found themselves witnesses to something that transcended normal political events. They were recording not just the words of a president, but the cultural assertion of a people who had rediscovered their voice. This tree, Traoré concluded, placing his hand on the bullet-scarred bark of the baobab, has stood for 1,000 years. It will stand for 1,000 more. The bullet it absorbed will become part of its strength, a reminder that some things cannot be killed because they are already eternal. He looked directly into each camera in turn, his gaze seeming to penetrate through the lenses to the audiences beyond. To the corporate executives planning their next assassination. Understand that every bullet you fire creates 1,000 freedom fighters. To the government ministers enabling neo-colonial exploitation. Remember that history will judge your complicity. To the African leaders still choosing foreign approval over domestic sovereignty. Know that your people are watching, learning, and organizing. The press conference ended, but its impact was only beginning. Within hours, excerpts were being broadcast on every major news network globally. Social media platforms struggled to manage the volume of sharing as Traoré's words reached audiences far beyond their intended scope. In Paris, emergency meetings convened at Mines du Sahel headquarters as executives realized their assassination plot had backfired catastrophically. Instead of eliminating a troublesome African leader, they had created a global symbol of resistance to corporate neocolonialism. In Washington, State Department officials drafted cautious statements supporting transparent investigation, while privately questioning whether their support for resource extraction companies was becoming politically unsustainable. In Beijing, foreign ministry strategists saw opportunity in the growing gap between African governments and their traditional Western partners, preparing to offer alternative trade relationships without the historical baggage of colonial exploitation. But the most significant reactions came from across Africa itself. In Nigeria's Niger Delta, communities that had suffered decades of environmental destruction from oil extraction organized solidarity rallies. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, union leaders cited Traoré's example while demanding better terms for copper and cobalt mining. In Ghana, traditional chiefs began questioning gold mining concessions that had been approved by previous governments. The bullet that had been meant to silence one voice had amplified the voice of an entire continent. 3 weeks after the assassination attempt, President Traoré stood before an extraordinary gathering in Accra, Ghana. The hastily convened African Resource Sovereignty Summit had attracted presidents, prime ministers and liberation movement leaders from across the continent, a level of Pan-African unity not seen since the early days of independence. The venue itself was symbolic. the Independence Arch where Kwame Nkrumah had declared Ghana's freedom from British rule in 1957. Now, 70 years later, African leaders were gathering to declare economic independence from the same colonial powers that had ostensibly departed decades earlier. Traoré's appearance had improved dramatically, though he still moved with careful deliberation. More importantly, the near-death experience had transformed his political persona from cautious reformer to prophetic voice of continental liberation. The bullet scar on his chest, visible through the traditional white bubu he wore, served as both a badge of survival and symbol of resistance. "Brothers and sisters," he began, speaking in French to accommodate the multilingual audience but with an oratorical power that transcended language barriers. "We gather not as beggars seeking aid, but as owners reclaiming our inheritance." The audience, heads of state, ministers, traditional rulers, civil society leaders, erupted in applause that echoed off the colonial-era buildings surrounding Independence Square. Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo, hosting the summit, nodded approvingly from his front-row seat. "For too long we have accepted the narrative that African poverty is natural, inevitable, the result of climate or geography or cultural failings," Traoré continued. "But poverty is not natural when you possess 30% of the world's mineral resources. Poverty is not inevitable when your soil feeds millions and your rivers generate enough hydroelectric power to illuminate continents." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before delivering the line that would become the summit's defining statement. "African poverty is not a condition, it is a crime. And every crime has perpetrators." Mali's President Assimi Goïta stood and applauded, followed quickly by his counterparts from Niger, Guinea, and Chad. Even leaders from more conservative governments, those traditionally aligned with former colonial powers, found themselves caught up in the momentum of Traoré's presentation. "The bullet they fired at me in my ancestral village was not aimed at Ibrahim Traoré alone," he declared, his voice rising. "It was aimed at every African child who walks kilometers for clean water while their groundwater is exported in plastic bottles to European supermarkets. It was aimed at every mother who watches her child die from preventable diseases while pharmaceutical companies patent traditional medicines discovered by her ancestors." The power of his words was amplified by their setting and timing. Social media had transformed the summit into a global event, with live streams reaching millions of viewers across Africa and the diaspora. Young people in Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Cairo organized viewing parties in universities and community centers, turning the political gathering into a cultural phenomenon. "We are not asking for permission to control our own resources," Traoré continued. "We are not seeking approval to feed our own children first. We are not negotiating for the right to educate our youth with the wealth they will inherit." He pulled out a folder containing documents that had been circulated to all summit participants, evidence compiled from the assassination investigation that revealed the scope of corporate interference in African politics. These documents show assassination plots in 17 African countries over the past decade. Leaders killed, elections manipulated, coups financed, all to ensure that African resources remain available at colonial prices to global markets. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. While many had suspected such coordination, seeing the evidence laid bare was galvanizing. In Ghana, a traditional chief who opposed a gold mining expansion was found dead in his car, apparently from a heart attack, though he was 34 years old and had no history of cardiac problems. Ghana's president shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the case. In Mali, a finance minister who questioned uranium pricing was killed in a plane crash during clear weather with an experienced pilot. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a union leader organizing copper miners received a package containing his daughter's severed finger, the same threat pattern used against my own family. Gasps of shock and murmurs of recognition rippled through the audience. Leaders who had experienced similar pressures began to understand they were not isolated incidents but part of a systematic campaign. "This is not a conspiracy theory," Traoré declared. "This is a conspiracy fact. And it ends today." He gestured toward a large map of Africa that had been erected behind the podium, showing resource flows from the continent to global markets, an intricate web of extraction that revealed the scope of economic colonialism. "We propose a continental resource compact. No African nation signs mining or extraction agreements without consultation with neighbors. No African leader accepts development aid tied to resource concessions. No African government allows environmental destruction without community consent." The proposal was radical but logical. By coordinating resource policies across borders, individual nations could resist the divide-and-conquer strategies that had kept them competing against each other for scraps from the global economy. But this is not merely about economics, Traoré continued, his voice taking on the cadence of traditional praise singers. This is about dignity. About our children growing up proud of their heritage instead of ashamed of their poverty. About our youth building careers at home instead of drowning in the Mediterranean seeking opportunities denied on their own continent. President Félix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo stood to speak, his massive frame commanding attention. President Traoré speaks the truth that we have been afraid to voice, he declared. In my country we export cobalt essential for every smartphone and electric vehicle on Earth, yet our people lack electricity. We ship copper that builds skyscrapers in Shanghai and New York, yet our children attend school under trees. His voice grew stronger as he continued. They call it free trade, but there is nothing free about armed guards protecting mining facilities while communities lack clean water. They call it economic development, but there is nothing developed about enriching shareholders while impoverishing workers. Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu added his voice to the growing chorus of support. The oil flowing from our Niger Delta has powered European and American industries for 50 years, yet the communities where it originates remain among the poorest and most polluted on Earth. We were told this was the price of development, that environmental sacrifice would eventually bring prosperity. Instead, it brought environmental destruction without prosperity. As leader after leader spoke, a pattern emerged. Each had stories of resource wealth flowing abroad while domestic poverty persisted. Each had experienced pressure, economic, diplomatic, sometimes violent, when they questioned existing arrangements. Each had been told by foreign advisors that their people weren't ready for resource sovereignty. Ready? Traoré interjected with bitter humor when the theme emerged repeatedly. Were the British ready for North Sea oil? Were the Norwegians ready for their petroleum wealth? Were the Canadians ready for their mining revenues? The rhetorical questions exposed the racism underlying arguments about African incapacity for resource management. We are ready because these are our resources, our lands, our people's inheritance. Readiness is not determined by foreign observers, it is claimed by sovereign peoples. As the first day of the summit concluded, something unprecedented in modern African politics was taking shape. Leaders who had spent decades competing for foreign investment were beginning to coordinate resistance to foreign exploitation. But beyond the formal political proceedings, a cultural awakening was simultaneously occurring. The summit's social media coverage had reached audiences far beyond government circles. African artists, intellectuals, and activists were using Traoré's survival and message to challenge fundamental assumptions about their continent's relationship with the world. In Lagos, Nigeria's entertainment capital, prominent musicians began composing songs celebrating African resource sovereignty. In Nairobi, tech entrepreneurs started developing apps to track resource flows and foreign corporate ownership. In Cape Town, university students organized academic conferences on decolonizing economics. The assassination attempt that was meant to silence African resistance had instead triggered a continental conversation about dignity, sovereignty, and the possibility of true independence. That evening, as Traoré rested in his hotel suite, he received a call that would reshape his understanding of the forces arrayed against African liberation. Mr. President, the voice said in accented English, this is Jean-Claude Dubois representing certain European business interests. I believe we need to discuss recent developments. Traoré felt his blood chill. Intelligence reports had identified Dubois as a corporate crisis manager, who specialized in containing political threats to international business, often through methods that operated in legal gray areas. I'm listening, Traoré replied cautiously. Your survival was unexpected. But perhaps it creates opportunities for dialogue that were not previously available. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the underlying threat. They had failed to kill him, so now they wanted to buy him. What kind of dialogue? The kind that recognizes mutual interests. Your people want development. European companies have capital and technology. Perhaps previous arrangements were insufficient. Perhaps new terms could be more generous. It was the same script that had been used to seduce and corrupt African leaders for decades. Offer just enough improvement to make compromise seem reasonable, while maintaining the fundamental power imbalance that kept resources flowing outward. Mr. Dubois, Traoré said quietly, let me save you some time. The bullet you people fired at me didn't just fail to kill my body. It killed my capacity for fear. Your threats don't work on dead men walking. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. Mr. President, I think you may be misunderstanding the scope of the consequences that could follow from uncooperative policies. No, Traoré replied with finality. I think you are misunderstanding the scope of the movement you tried to stop with a Belgian sniper. Goodbye, Mr. Dubois. As he ended the call, Traoré felt the presence of his ancestors gathering around him once again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new attempts to divide the African leadership gathering in Accra. But tonight, for the first time since independence, an entire continent was beginning to speak with one voice. And that voice was saying, no more. 6 months after the assassination attempt, the African Resource Sovereignty Compact signed in Accra had transformed from an aspirational document to political reality. 12 African nations had synchronized their mining and extraction policies, creating what economists were calling the Traoré effect. A fundamental shift in global commodity markets as African suppliers began demanding fair prices for their resources. The response from traditional economic powers had been swift and severe. France had withdrawn its military bases from 3 West African countries, claiming inability to guarantee security in the new political environment. The United States had suspended development aid to compact signatories, citing concerns about economic governance. The World Bank had frozen loan approvals, demanding structural reforms before releasing funds. But something unexpected was happening. African economies were not collapsing as predicted. Instead, they were diversifying. China, India, and Brazil had stepped in with trade agreements that offered better terms than traditional partners. African countries were trading more with each other, using their own currencies instead of French francs or American dollars. Technology transfer programs were bringing mining expertise from Russia and engineering knowledge from Turkey. Most importantly, resource revenues were staying home. Schools were being built, hospitals equipped, roads paved, all funded by wealth that had previously enriched foreign shareholders. President Traoré stood in his office in Ouagadougou, reviewing intelligence reports that painted a picture of corporate desperation and governmental panic in capitals across Europe and North America. The assassination that was meant to preserve the old order had accelerated its destruction. Mr. President, his aide Moussa Diallo announced, your guest has arrived. The guest was Dr. Aisha Okonkwo, Nigeria's new finance minister and one of the compact's chief architects. She had requested an urgent meeting to discuss what intelligence sources were calling Operation Sahel Storm, a coordinated campaign to destabilize the resource sovereignty movement through economic warfare and political manipulation. Sister Aisha, Traoré greeted her warmly in the Pan-African spirit that had emerged from the summit. What brings you to Burkina Faso so urgently? Dr. Okonkwo, a brilliant economist who had earned her PhD from Oxford before returning to Africa to fight economic colonialism, wasted no time on pleasantries. They're planning something massive, she said, opening a briefcase filled with documents. Our intelligence network has identified a 3-phase operation designed to break the compact within the next 6 months. She spread out charts and communications intercepts that revealed a sophisticated campaign of financial warfare. Phase 1, currency attacks. They're going to simultaneously short the currencies of all compact members, triggering artificial inflation and economic crisis. Traoré studied the documents, recognizing the pattern from previous economic assaults on developing nations. Phase 2, infrastructure sabotage. Critical infrastructure in participating countries will experience technical failures and maintenance problems that will be blamed on inexperienced African management. And Phase 3? Traoré asked, though he suspected he already knew. Regime change. They'll fund opposition movements, organize protests, and if necessary support military coups against compact governments. The narrative will be that African resource sovereignty leads inevitably to economic collapse and political instability. It was a familiar playbook, but scaled up to continental proportions. The same strategies that had been used to destabilize individual African countries were now being coordinated across the region. How certain is this intelligence? Traoré asked. Certain enough that 3 other heads of state are flying here for an emergency meeting tonight. We need to decide how to respond before they begin implementation. Before Traoré could respond, his secure phone buzzed with a priority message from General Ouedraogo. Corporate mercenaries identified at 3 border positions. Possible preparation for cross-border destabilization. Recommend immediate consultation. The timing confirmed Dr. Okonkwo's intelligence. Operation Sahel Storm was not a distant threat, it was already beginning. That evening, Traoré's compound became the site of an extraordinary gathering. Presidents Goïta of Mali, Bazoum of Niger, and Akufo-Addo of Ghana had arrived with minimal security, understanding that the crisis required personal diplomacy rather than formal protocol. "Brothers," Traoré began as they gathered in his private study, "we face the greatest threat to African sovereignty since the colonial conquest. Not armies this time, but economics designed to create the same result: African wealth flowing to foreign accounts while African people suffer." President Goïta, the youngest of the leaders and a former military officer, spoke first. "In Mali, our gold mines have tripled their security forces over the past month. They claim it's for protection against terrorism, but our intelligence suggests they're preparing to defend against civil unrest they plan to create." Ghana's Akufo-Addo, the most senior leader present, shook his head grimly. "The pattern is consistent. In Ghana, our cocoa cooperative leaders have received death threats. In Côte d'Ivoire, opposition politicians who have been quiet for years are suddenly well-funded and organizing massive rallies against the compact." Niger's Bazoum added his own observations. "Our uranium facilities have requested permission to bring in additional technical consultants, Europeans with military backgrounds who claim expertise in security assessment. It's the same personnel who were identified in corporate assassination networks." As the leaders shared intelligence, a clear picture emerged. The corporate and governmental interests threatened by African resource sovereignty were implementing a comprehensive destabilization campaign that would make previous interventions look subtle by comparison. "We have three choices," Dr. Okonkwo analyzed with academic precision. "Surrender the compact and return to colonial economic relationships. Fight individually and be defeated separately. Or escalate our coordination to match their escalation." "What does escalation look like?" President Bazoum asked. Traoré had been thinking about this possibility since receiving the first intelligence reports. The answer would require African leadership to take a step that few had contemplated since independence. "Complete economic separation," he said quietly. "No trade with countries that support corporate destabilization of African governments. No use of their currencies. No participation in their financial institutions. Total economic independence." The silence that followed was profound. What Traoré was proposing amounted to economic war against the world's most powerful nations, a confrontation that could either liberate Africa or destroy it. "The risks are enormous," President Akufo-Addo said carefully. "Our economies are still dependent on European and American markets. Complete separation could cause immediate hardship for our people. Greater hardship than watching our children grow up poor while sitting on the world's most valuable resources?" Traoré challenged. "Greater hardship than seeing our youth risk death crossing the Sahara and Mediterranean because they can't find opportunities on the resource-richest continent on Earth?" President Goïta leaned forward, his military training evident in his tactical thinking. "If we're going to fight, we need to understand their vulnerabilities. What do they lose if African resources are no longer available at colonial prices?" Dr. Okonkwo had prepared for this question. "Everything," she said simply. "Cobalt for their electric vehicles comes primarily from Congo. Platinum for their catalytic converters comes from South Africa. Uranium for their nuclear power comes from Niger and Namibia. Cocoa for their chocolate comes from West Africa. Gold for their jewelry and electronics comes from Ghana and Mali." She paused to let the implications sink in. "They need us more than we need them. The entire global economy depends on African resources sold at artificially low prices. If we coordinate our policies and demand fair payment, they face inflation, industrial disruption, and political crisis in their own countries. But they have military superiority," President Bazoum pointed out. "If economic pressure fails, they could resort to direct intervention." Traoré smiled, the expression carrying something both grim and confident. "Military superiority against what? They can't invade an entire continent. They can't occupy every mine, every port, every resource facility. And most importantly, they can't bomb ideas." He gestured toward his chest, where the bullet scar remained visible. "They tried to kill me to prevent African resource sovereignty. Instead, they created a continental movement. What happens when they try to invade African countries to steal African resources? They create global awareness that their prosperity depends on our exploitation." The conversation continued deep into the night, with the leaders working through scenarios, contingencies, and coordination mechanisms. By dawn, they had reached a consensus that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The African Resource Sovereignty Compact would be expanded into the African Economic Independence Alliance. Member nations would coordinate not just resource policies but all trade relationships, prioritizing commerce with partners who respected African sovereignty over those who demanded continued subordination. This is either the beginning of true African independence, President Akufo-Addo said as the meeting concluded, or the start of a war that will reshape global economics. Perhaps both, Traoré replied. But the alternative, continued exploitation while pretending to be independent, is no longer acceptable. As his fellow presidents departed, Traoré stood once again beneath the baobab tree in his compound, this time accompanied by Dr. Okonkwo and General Ouedraogo. The bullet scar in the ancient bark had already begun healing, new growth covering the wound while incorporating it into the tree's continuing life. "Are we ready for what comes next?" Dr. Okonkwo asked. Traoré touched the matching scar on his own chest, feeling the raised tissue that marked his survival and transformation. "My grandmother used to say that the hunter who fears the lion will never eat meat," he replied. "We've been living on scraps for 70 years. It's time to hunt." That afternoon, as news of the alliance broke on international media, stock markets in London, Paris, and New York experienced their worst single-day losses in decades. The mere possibility that African resources might be priced at market rates rather than colonial discounts sent shockwaves through industries that had built their profit margins on African exploitation. But in Ouagadougou, Lagos, Accra, and Bamako, celebrations erupted in the streets. The bullet that had been meant to preserve economic colonialism had finally shattered it completely. The lion had learned to roar. 2 years after the assassination attempt that changed everything, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly for the second time. But the man addressing the world's leaders bore little resemblance to the cautious African president who had first spoken there, seeking understanding and cooperation. This Traoré radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had stared death in the face and emerged not just alive but transformed. The bullet scar on his chest, visible through his traditional white bubu, had become an internationally recognized symbol of African resistance to neo-colonial exploitation. The hall was packed in a way it rarely was for African speakers. The African Economic Independence Alliance now comprised 23 nations, representing over 800 million people and controlling significant portions of the world's mineral wealth. When this bloc spoke, the world listened, not from courtesy but from necessity. "Honorable delegates," Traoré began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had survived an assassination attempt and turned it into a continental awakening. 2 years ago, I stood at this podium asking the international community to understand why African nations were reclaiming sovereignty over our natural resources. He paused, allowing his words to resonate through the hushed assembly. Today, I stand here reporting on the results of that reclamation. What followed was a presentation that stunned even seasoned international observers. Economic data, development statistics, and quality of life indicators that showed dramatic improvements across alliance member countries. Child mortality down 40%. School enrollment up 60%. Rural electrification increased by 300%. Infrastructure development proceeding at unprecedented rates. These improvements were not achieved through foreign aid or international loans, Traoré emphasized. They were achieved through the simple principle that African resources should primarily benefit African people. In the audience, representatives from former colonial powers shifted uncomfortably. The success of the alliance had shattered decades of economic orthodoxy that insisted African countries needed foreign expertise and capital to develop their resources. But we have not come here today to celebrate our successes, Traoré continued, his tone becoming more serious. We have come to address the attempts to undermine those successes through what we now call the New Scramble for Africa. He gestured to a large screen behind him, which displayed a map showing documented intervention attempts across the continent. Assassination plots, coup attempts, currency manipulation, infrastructure sabotage, all traced back to corporate and governmental interests threatened by African economic independence. In the past 18 months, our intelligence services have documented 127 separate attempts to destabilize alliance governments. 53 assassination plots against African leaders. 34 cyber attacks on African financial institutions. 48 cases of infrastructure sabotage designed to create artificial crises. The specificity of the numbers sent ripples of unease through the assembly. This was not rhetorical accusation but documented evidence of systematic intervention. The response to African economic sovereignty has been swift and coordinated. When we refused to sell our uranium at prices set in European boardrooms, nuclear facilities in France experienced unexpected technical difficulties. When we demanded fair payment for our cocoa, chocolate companies launched media campaigns claiming African farmers were incapable of sustainable production. When we organized regional trade agreements using our own currencies, international financial institutions declared our economies unstable and risky for investment. Traoré's voice carried the measured tone of someone presenting evidence rather than making accusations. But the most revealing response came when alliance countries began achieving the development goals that foreign aid had promised for decades but never delivered. Suddenly, our success was described as unsustainable, our growth as artificial, our independence as dangerous isolationism. He faced the assembly directly, his gaze seeming to address each delegation individually. Apparently, African prosperity is considered a threat to global stability. The irony was palpable and intentional. For centuries, African poverty had been blamed on African failures. Now African success was being blamed on African unreasonableness. Today, I want to address this concern directly. Yes, the alliance represents a threat to economic relationships based on exploitation. Yes, our policies are disruptive to profit margins built on paying colonial prices for 21st century resources. Yes, our success challenges established order, the order that kept 1.3 billion Africans poor while their continent's wealth enriched others. As he spoke, Traoré moved away from the podium, walking closer to the assembly in a gesture of direct engagement. But let me be absolutely clear about what the alliance does not threaten. We do not threaten legitimate trade relationships based on mutual benefit. We do not threaten technological cooperation that respects African sovereignty. We do not threaten cultural exchange that honors African contributions to global civilization. He paused, allowing the distinction to sink in. We threaten only those relationships that require African subordination for their continuation. The response from the Global South was immediate and overwhelming, sustained applause that seemed to come from every delegation representing formerly colonized nations. The message was clear. The alliance spoke not just for Africa but for every country that had experienced economic exploitation disguised as international cooperation. The bullet fired at me in my ancestral village was meant to preserve an economic system where African leaders who served foreign interests were rewarded while those who served African interests were eliminated, Traoré said as the applause subsided. But assassination only works when you can kill an idea by killing a person. He touched his chest where the scar remained visible. They discovered that African resource sovereignty is not dependent on any individual leader. It is an idea whose time has come, carried forward by hundreds of millions of people who have decided they will no longer accept poverty amid plenty. The presentation concluded with footage from across alliance countries: new schools built with mining revenues, hospitals equipped with resource wealth, roads connecting rural communities to markets, solar power facilities bringing electricity to villages that had lived in darkness for generations. This is what African resource sovereignty looks like, Traoré declared as images of development and prosperity filled the screen. Not chaos, not isolation, not economic collapse, but the simple principle that the wealth of Africa should benefit the children of Africa first. As he returned to his seat, the standing ovation came not just from African delegations but from representatives across the Global South, Latin America, Asia, the Pacific Islands, regions that recognized their own struggles in Africa's fight for economic justice. But the real impact of Traoré's address was not measured in applause but in the response it triggered worldwide. Within hours, social media was flooded with support from young people across 6 continents who saw in the alliance's success a model for challenging global economic inequality. University students in Sao Paulo organized solidarity protests outside mining company headquarters. Labor unions in Mumbai issued statements supporting African workers' rights to fair wages for their resources. Indigenous communities in Canada and Australia cited the alliance as inspiration for their own struggles against extractive industries. Most significantly, African diaspora communities, from London to New York to Toronto, began organizing investment networks to support alliance development projects, creating financial flows from African prosperity back to African communities worldwide. That evening, as Traoré prepared to return to Burkina Faso, he received a video call from his ancestral village. The screen filled with familiar faces, village elders, childhood friends, the children who had watched him speak to international media under the baobab tree 2 years earlier. "The tree remembers," said the elderly griot who had become the village's informal historian since Traoré's grandmother passed away. "The bullet it absorbed has become part of its strength. New branches grow from the wound." Behind him, Traoré could see the baobab tree, its massive canopy now bearing fresh fruit that villagers were harvesting. Children who had been too young to understand the significance of that morning when bullets flew were now old enough to climb its branches and gather its bounty. "And our son?" the griot asked. "Has he also grown new branches from his wound?" Traoré considered the question seriously. The physical scar would remain forever, but its meaning had evolved. What had begun as evidence of an assassination attempt had become a symbol of survival, then resistance, then transformation. "The branches I have grown extend across continents," he replied in more the language of his ancestors. "They bear fruit that will feed generations yet unborn." As the call ended, Traoré stood at his hotel window overlooking Manhattan, where lights twinkled like earthbound stars. Somewhere in those lights were African immigrants sending remittances home, African students studying in universities, African artists and entrepreneurs building lives in the diaspora while maintaining connections to ancestral soil. The alliance had given them something that decades of independence had not: pride in African success, confidence in African capacity, hope that their children might choose to build their futures in Africa rather than seek them elsewhere. The bullet that was meant to silence one African voice had amplified the voice of an entire continent and its global family. Tomorrow Traoré would return to Burkina Faso, to the red soil where his blood had once watered the earth and his survival had planted seeds of transformation. He would continue the work of building an economy that served his people's needs rather than foreign shareholders' profits. But tonight he felt the presence of his ancestors gathering around him once more, not in sorrow or supplication but in celebration. The children of Africa had remembered how to stand up. The descendants of great kingdoms and trading empires had reclaimed their heritage as equals in the global community. The lion had not just learned to roar. The lion had learned to rule.